Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another CEN seminar. It is wonderful to see so many of you have turned up for this one. So this is a very, very interesting topic today. We've got Elora Taieb from Cité in Paris, who's going to be telling us about cognitive variability in poor academic achievement with a focus on reading and or math difficulties. So Elora is a fourth-year PhD student in cognitive and developmental psychology, as I said, at Gregoire Bourse Child Development and Educational Psychology Lab, Cité in Paris, who we have a close relationship with. So her doctoral research, supervised by Irene Altarelli and Teresa Uculano, focuses on characterizing the cognitive underpinnings of educational inequalities. And specifically, one of her main research areas involves examining the cognitive and environmental factors that contribute to poor reading and poor mathematics achievement in primary school children. So with that said, I'm going to hand over to Elora for a very fascinating and enlightening talk.
Thank you very much, Astrid. And thank you, everyone, for having me here today. I'm really excited. So yes, I'm a first-year PhD student. I'm doing my PhD, as you said, under the supervision of Irene Altarelli and Teresa Uculano at Cité. And the study which I will present to you today is part of the broader thesis work on let's say, cognitive and environmental determinants of reading and math achievements and difficulties. So we all know that successful reading and mathematics acquisition in early primary school is an essential milestone. It has been shown to be associated to academic success in later educational stages, also with future quality of life, as well as with socioeconomic status achieved in adulthood. Yet, a significant proportion of children struggle with reading and/or math learning. These difficulties are not necessarily linked to dyslexia or dyscalculia, but they still affect a substantial number of children. And notably across international European studies, we know that in fourth grades, around 22% of children do not reach a basic proficiency level in reading. And it is the same for mathematics. 26% of children do not reach this basic proficiency level in fourth grade. So this is an important educational issue to really better understand the cognitive and the sources in general of this underachievement for some children. One of the factors that we know is that reading and mathematics difficulties seem to vary with SES. And for example, there are studies showing that the prevalence of poor readers or poor math achievers is higher in children from low SES backgrounds than in children from high SES backgrounds. However, it does not mean that high SES children do not experience academic difficulties. For example, a study by Holzer and collaborators showed that a specific profile of high SES children also demonstrated academic difficulties. So characterizing the sources of poor academic achievements represents a major educational issue in promoting more equitable learning opportunities for all children across diverse socioeconomic backgrounds. Regarding academic difficulties, we know that they are influenced by a broad range of cognitive factors. For example, studies especially on dyslexia and dyscalculia, showed that domain-specific factors are influencing difficulties in reading or math. By domain-specific, I mean factors that are only or more specifically involved in only reading or in only math achievements. So regarding domain-specific factors influencing reading difficulties, studies have especially highlighted poor oral language and phonological awareness skills in poor readers, but also poor rapid automatized naming, which is our ability to retrieve rapidly lexical representations from memory. And also, recently, there were studies on visual attention span, which is the amount of visual information that can be processed within a brief visual fixation. And those studies on visual attention span showed, for example, that dyslexic children and also poor readers had a shorter visual attention span compared to a control group of children without difficulties. For domain-specific difficulties of mathematics, studies have highlighted cognitive deficits in transcoding, which is our ability to go from the oral code, such as the word 3, to the symbolic code, the written code, but also difficulties in symbolic processing, such as symbolic comparison, and with non-symbolic processing, which is our ability to compare quantities without being associated to symbols. On top of that, studies have also highlighted the role of domain general cognitive factors in academic difficulties, including executive functions such as working memory, inhibition, and cognitive flexibility, and also selective attention. So, as I was saying, this research often are based on children showing dyslexia or dyscalculia, and there is not much research on poor academic achievement. So it is also an interesting question to know whether poor academic achievers exhibit similar cognitive weaknesses as children showing specific learning disorders. Okay, so that's the first point. The second point is that even if children with difficulties show different kinds of cognitive impairments, they are not a homogeneous group. And this has been not studied a lot yet, but there is evidence that we found heterogeneity within children with academic difficulties in both poor readers and poor math achievers. As an illustration, for example, the mean of a group with difficulties could be lower than the mean of a group with typical achievement, but it does not mean that all children within the difficulty group would show difficulties in, let's say, a cognitive variable. So there is really a dispersion around the mean that is of relevance to study the heterogeneity within poor academic achievement. So there are not much studies on this topic yet, but there are some, and I will show you two examples. So, for example, Valdoi and collaborateur in 2021 studied the cognitive difficulties of poor readers among three main domain-specific cognitive variables in reading, which are visual attention span, phonological awareness, and rapid automatized naming. And what they found is that the prevalence of cognitive deficits was really heterogeneous within the poor readers group, with some children showing isolated deficits in phonological awareness, some isolated deficits in visual attention span, and some in rapid automatized naming. There were also a proportion of children showing cumulative cognitive deficits between some or all of these variables. And there was also a significant proportion of children showing none of these cognitive deficits. Regarding mathematics, one study by Barthollet et al. In 2014 examined the cognitive variability of dyscalculic children. And without going into much detail, they identified that within dyscalculic children, there were 6 different profiles of children with different combinations of cognitive weaknesses. So that's the way we want to go to examine further the cognitive variability in poor academic achievement. What we want to add to those studies is that they are often not considering enough domain general impairments, which could be high, an important factor to consider if children are showing domain general impairments. We have to know that to address and develop effective remediation strategies. And also those studies did not really take SES into account and look at whether some profiles are rather characterized by low SES children and other more by high SES children, for example. So the aims of our study was first to characterize the general cognitive profile of poor readers and poor math achievers at the group level, but then to go further and examine the cognitive heterogeneity within poor readers and poor math achievers at the inter-individual level. So regarding our hypothesis, we expected to find in both poor readers and poor math achievers these distinct cognitive profiles of children. And we also expected that if SES would relate to profile membership, low SES children should be more represented in a profile with broader cognitive difficulties. So considering our methodology, we recruited third graders from 19 elementary schools that were located in Paris and surrounding areas. We only included children with normal or corrected to normal vision, children with no auditory, neurological, or neurodevelopmental disorder, children who scored within 2 standard deviations of a non-verbal IQ test or higher, relatively to the age norm, children who didn't have a history of grade retention or acceleration, and children who learned the French language before the age of 3. This resulted in a sample of 472 participants with a mean age of 8.6 years old, and who were coming from socioeconomically diverse backgrounds, because we specifically selected schools within regions that were known for their high social diversity. And just to illustrate this point, we had around 1/3 of children whose parents did not attain higher education, around 1/3 whose parents completed 2 years of higher education, and 1/3 of children whose parents completed more of 2 years of higher education. Concerning our experimental design, it was divided into 4 individual testing sessions at school that were about 30 minutes each in quiet rooms of the schools, and that were conducted with by trained research assistants and I. In the first testing session, we evaluated the academic performance in reading and mathematics. For reading, we had tests of text reading and word list reading, which were used to compute a reading composite score, as well as for math, we had a mental calculation and written calculation tests, and word problems and math fluency tests. All of those measures were really highly correlated, and so we computed composite scores, but I will also show you after results for individual measures. In the second session, we evaluated the main general cognitive abilities. So we had working memory assessments. We had an assessment of inhibition and cognitive flexibility, and an assessment of selective attention, which is a cancellation task, a visual search task. In the third session, we assessed reading-specific cognitive abilities with oral language assessment, phonological awareness tests, rapid automatized naming, which I was saying is our ability to retrieve quickly lexical representations from memory. So children had to name the objects that were presented as fast as possible. And lastly, visual attention span, which was a task that has been previously used before. And the visual attention span is as I was saying, again, the quantity of visual information that we can process very quickly. So just to show you an example of an item, you will see a 5-letter string appear on the right of the screen, and children had to name as many letters as possible afterwards. So just to show you, so it is as fast as that. It's 200 milliseconds. And the idea is that the higher your visual attention span, the more letters you can process, and so it's better because you have a higher window of letter processing, if I say it in this way. And lastly, the fourth session was the evaluation of math-specific cognitive abilities, in which we assessed transcoding abilities, as well as one-digit symbolic comparison and one-digit non-symbolic comparison using the numeracy screener and the approximate number system, which is a non-symbolic task, but with a larger number quantities. We also assess socioeconomic status using a questionnaire completed by the parents, in which we asked for parental education and parental occupation. And based on those two indices, we then computed the composite score of SES, again, because the two variables were highly correlated. Regarding our procedure now, so we took our whole population and we identified a subpopulation of poor readers as defined by those scoring below the 25th percentile of the reading composite score. So this is not a very stringent threshold, but this is because we are really interested in poor academic achievement in general and not in specific learning disorders. We also did the same for the math and ended up with a subpopulation of 118 poor math achievers. What you have to know is that there was a degree of overlap between poor readers and poor math achievers. And indeed, 45% of the poor readers were also poor math achievers and vice versa. So this is a point that we can discuss further. For now, we chose to keep I would say the comorbid children, but the children showing who were both poor readers and poor math achievers within those groups. and to do the analysis separately for poor readers and poor math achievers. But in further steps of analysis, we will try to disentangle between poor readers only, poor math achievers only, and comorbid children. But you have to know that for this presentation, some comorbid children are included in the poor readers group, and also some comorbid children are included in the poor math achievers group. Regarding our analytic approach, so for both poor readers and poor math achievers separately, we first compared the groups to a control group of average readers or math achievers. Then we applied latent profile analysis, which is a statistical approach that focuses on identifying latent subgroups within a population based on a given set of variables. And then we ran profile comparisons to know, for example, whether distinct profiles were differing on environmental variables such as SES, for example. So for the study one, which focuses exclusively on poor readers, we first of all check the academic performance with group comparisons. So this is nothing new, this is all expected. So we define the group this way. They are, of course, different on the reading composite, but as expected, they are also different on the individual reading variables. Concerning cognitive abilities at the group level, we found that poor readers in blue are significantly achieving lower than average readers only in working memory with respect to domain general variables. Concerning domain-specific variables, they are achieving lower in all of the domain-specific variables tested. Then, more interestingly, we went at the inter-individual level and applied a latent profile analysis on the poor readers group with domain general and domain-specific variables. What we found is that fit indices of the model were supporting a two-profile solution within the poor readers population. First of all, we found a first profile of poor readers, which concerns 24% of the poor readers, showing a broad cognitive weaknesses across both domain general and domain specific abilities. So what is represented on the y-axis is the z-score. So it means, so a z-score of 0 represents the mean of the total sample. So here we see that on average, children in profile 1 are lower than the mean of the total sample for all of the variables tested, like entered in the model. We then found the existence of another profile, which concerns around 3/4 of the poor readers population, which did not show a significant alteration in domain general performance, nor in oral language and phonological awareness, but which showed specific RAN and visual attention span deficits. RAN is rapid automatized naming. So there was one profile with broad cognitive weaknesses and one with very specific weaknesses in rapid automatized naming and visual attention span. We then wanted to compare the profiles on academic performance with the idea that we expected, based on that the more cognitively impaired profile would maybe show a lower reading performance than the profile with only specific weaknesses. And this was not the case. So what we found is that the two profiles, PR1 and PR2, are lower than an average control group in all of the reading measures, but they are not significantly different from one another. So this is really interesting. It seems that just having a visual attention span or a RAN deficit could lower the performance as similarly as having broad cognitive weaknesses. And then regarding socioeconomic status, we compared the profiles to the mean of the total sample. And we found that children in profile 1, so which were more broadly cognitively affected, tended to come from lower socioeconomic status as compared to the mean of the total sample. So, as a summary, we found that as a group, poor readers are impacted on all domain-specific variables and on working memory, but that there was heterogeneity within poor readers, with the majority of children showing isolated domain-specific weaknesses in rapid automatized naming and visual attention span, but yet with a notable proportion of children showing broader domain-specific weaknesses accompanied with domain general ones, and which tended to come from who tended to come from lower SES backgrounds. Second, we did the same for the poor math achievers. Again, bear in mind that some poor readers were also in the poor math achievers group. So concerning group analysis, again, we found, as expected, that the poor math achievers were significantly lower than the average math achievers on all the math variables. Regarding cognitive abilities, we found that the poor math achievers group was achieving lower than the average math achievers group on the executive functions measures, namely working memory, inhibition, and cognitive flexibility, but not on selective attention. And that there was achieving lower than the average math achievers group on all the domain-specific variables tested. Again, we went then at the inter-individual level by applying latent profile analysis. And this time, the fit indices of the latent profile model supported a 3-profile solution within the poor math achievers group. And each profile contained around 1/3 of the poor math achievers. The first profile that was identified was characterized by broad cognitive weaknesses in both domain general cognitive abilities and also domain-specific cognitive abilities. The second profile, surprisingly, showed no cognitive weakness at all. So they did not differ from the total sample mean in none of the variables. And lastly, the third profile of poor math achievers was characterized by children having executive function weaknesses associated with specific weaknesses in transcoding and ANS. Then again, we compared the profiles to one another in academic performance. And first of all, we, as expected, found that all of the poor math achievers profiles differed from an average math achievers group, which is expected. But this time we also found that, which is kind of coherent, that the no cognitive weakness profile, the profile 2, was having a significantly higher math performance than the more cognitively affected profiles 1 and 3. And lastly, on SES, there was no difference between the groups, between the profiles, I should say. They were all significantly coming from lower SES backgrounds than the sample mean. Okay, I hope I have not lost you. So as a summary for this second part of the study, as a group, we found that poor math achievers are impacted on all domain-specific variables and on executive functions. We also found evidence for heterogeneity within poor math achievers, with evidence of 3 distinct profiles. 2 profiles who were showing domain general weaknesses associated with either broad domain-specific weaknesses for profile 1 or with specific transcoding and ANS weaknesses for profile 3. But we also found 1 profile without any cognitive weakness, profile 2. So this is really interesting, and there are plenty of possibilities that could enable, that could lead profile 2 to have math difficulties without showing cognitive difficulties in the variables that we have tested. We will not be able to test every possibility, of course, but maybe we can try to go further. And as we also have language and phonological awareness assessments for the reading study, we could also try to better explore whether these second profiles might show oral language or phonological awareness weaknesses, which have been shown to be also to influence math achievements and math difficulties in some cases. So that could be a further analysis to do. And lastly, all profiles tended to come from lower SES backgrounds in the poor math achievers group. So to summarize, we have found a large heterogeneity within both poor readers and poor math achievers. So there is really a necessity to go beyond average outcomes when we characterize academic difficulties. And this has implications for individualized educational interventions, because as we showed, all poor readers and all poor math achievers might not need the same educational support, depending on the combination of cognitive weaknesses that they show. And so it is necessary to have this approach to better tailor interventions to each child's profile. Of course, there were also limitations of within this study. So first of all, this is a cross-sectional study. So it does not enable to know whether the cognitive weaknesses identified across profiles are the underlying cause of academic difficulties. So it is yet a first step, but there is the necessity to go beyond that with longitudinal and training studies. And of course, there is the comorbidity issue. So the fact that here, some children were both included in the poor readers group and the poor math achievers group, while maybe they could represent a distinct profile of their own. And this is something that is really highly debated in the literature to know whether comorbid children have rather an addition of the difficulties of poor readers only and poor math achievers only, or if they are characterized by other distinct difficulties. So this is not something that I can answer yet with those studies, but I think we can try to disentangle a bit better in future analysis. However, you have to know that we ran the same latent profile analysis on the poor achievers groups without the comorbid children, and we obtained the same results. It's just that then our sample size and power is really diminished, but the results were the same. Okay, so thank you very much for listening to my presentation, and I will also end by thank my co-authors in this work, and please feel free to ask your questions, and I'm also or your comments, and you can also write to me later if you have specific comments or discussions that you want to have. Thanks.
I think you deserve a massive round of applause, Elora. This is a massive, massive study and a massive undertaking that you've done, and you've summed it up for us very, very succinctly and clearly and concisely. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. So we've got a few questions that have come in. I think I'll actually start with Daniel's because it touches on one of your limitations at the end.
Yeah.
So Daniel asks, do you have any plans to conduct longitudinal follow-ups with these students at the moment?
Yeah. So this is not what we planned for the first initial idea of the project, but yes, we want to have longitudinal follow-up, and one lead that we will have is to have access to the French National Ministry data of children who have each year national evaluations. So it will not be exactly the same test as we have been conducting, but we will have access to reading and math performance like at different educational stages afterwards.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Elora. I think I'll go to Joe's question next. So Joe asks a very technical question. Did you consider splitting your sample into those who perform below the 10th percentile, who are often considered being different from just being at risk, to those between the 11th and the 25th percentile to see if there were any different profiles?
Yeah, so that's a great point. We did not yet. We tried with the 5th percentile, which is a very stringent cutoff for dyslexia and dyscalculia. I did not try with the 10th percentile. For the 5th percentile, there was not great changes in the result. But yes, that's a great point, and maybe it could also give different results. The only problem is again our limited sample size afterwards. But yeah.
Thank you. That's really good to know that you did. You tried it with the 5th as well. So I'm going to skip backwards because we had a really interesting question from Catherine right at the start because she had to leave. So she says, having heard the last few CN talks on autism, ADHD, dyspraxia, etc., my question is how, when you're analyzing cognitive variability, you differentiate between cognitive ability and sort of neurodiversity related, she said obstacle, but kind of like measurement error. So like, you know, emotional dysregulation, overwhelm, lack of interest, etc., which prevents sort of accurate measurement of ability. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think it's a great point too. We did not specifically address this point yet, but I don't know if we would be able to do it anyway. We also have socio-emotional measures from which I haven't talked today. But the idea is also to see if the profiles could also differ in socio-emotional aspects, but this is not something we have been doing yet.
Yeah. Because really it's an issue with the measurement tools, isn't it, really,
Yeah.
that you choose, and what kind of measurement error and such that they've sort of got built in, and what are their target populations that they've been normed on, or, you know, whatever. So I think
Yes.
it's a very...
So just one point that I could add is that we chose exclusively standardized tests or tasks that were previously validated in the literature. So that's only what I could add, but it does not mean that they are measurement free, of course. Error free, measurement error free. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Before I go to everybody else's questions, I kind of had a related question myself, which was that you mentioned that obviously diagnosis was not a focus for this study, but did you take any data on diagnostic status or all that kind of thing?
Yes.
Yeah, you did.
Yes, we did. The problem is that at this age, not all of them are, I mean, not all children who should be diagnosed with dyslexia or dyscalculia are indeed diagnosed with it. Also because some were, I mean, I think in low SES in general, diagnoses are often less often occurring or less easily occurring. But yes, we have data, but we don't really, for example, we had no dyslexic in the parent reports, since I think in the, like based on the scores, we should have some of them in the sample. And in the parents' reports, we had some of dyslexic, but not much of them. But yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting because it raises a point about reliability, right? And
Yes.
you know, how reliable is this reporting, particularly in the sample and the low SES that you were sort of working with? Yeah, very interesting. Daniel, would you maybe like to ask your next question out loud? And
yeah, sure. First of all, thanks for that talk. That was really very interesting and super clear. I noticed you had like the 1 to 9 ANS task, and then you had the Panama task, which exceeds that range. And it looked to me on your graphs, at least, that the small 1 to 9 was more discriminating between groups than the large 1 to 9, right? Yeah. So if we look at especially in profile 1, right? And I wonder what your thoughts are on that, because arguably one could say that, you know, the large task that doesn't contain any supervisable quantity, that should be the most discriminating task if the ANS is impaired. So I'm just wondering whether you think there might be evidence of subitizing there.
Yeah, it could be. I think maybe also, and that is something I want to look at further after, but maybe it is also a measurement type of task, like because the 1 to 9 non-symbolic is really close to the symbolic one in terms of format. Maybe it could also explain why we have those results, because the non-symbolic 1 to 9 task does not correlate well with the ANS, whereas it correlates highly with the symbolic formats. So that's something also that we have been a bit struggling to interpret, and I have to reflect more about that, but yeah.
That's super interesting. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Thanks, Daniel. Chris, I can see you've got your camera on. I don't know if you'd like to ask your question out loud as well.
Yeah, very happy to. And Elora, just to echo what others are saying, such an interesting talk, really, really enjoyable. So you mentioned that 45% of your sample difficulties were common to both folks with reading difficulties and maths difficulties.
Yeah.
Perhaps to be expected. When you were doing your profile analyses, it seemed that profile 1 in each case were people who had more domain general difficulties.
Yes.
You might expect that 45% of people themselves to have domain general problems because they have both reading difficulties and math difficulties.
Yes.
So were members of that 45% subsample differentially represented in profile 1? I mean, did they all appear in profile 1 of the reading analysis and profile 1 of the maths analysis?
Yes. So that's a really great point. So I did not look at the individual IDs of comorbid children for each case, but what I can show you is other complementary analysis I have done is, yes, like that, is to compare the profiles on the kind of opposite academic domain. For example, here, sorry, I don't have a legend, but it's the poor readers profiles. And what we found is that they are all lower, like the two profiles are lower than the average achievers in math, but that the profile 1 with domain general difficulties is even lower than profile 2. Yeah. And so it seems that maybe comorbid children are more represented in the profile 1, but that in general, reading and math difficulties are really highly associated with one another. And I can show you the same for the math. So those are the math profiles for the reading variables. And here, interestingly, we don't find differences between the math profiles on the reading variables. They are all significantly achieving lower in reading. Mm-hmm. So I hope it answers a bit the questions.
Yeah, it does, right? It's sort of broadly in line with what you might expect. And it's a really interesting way of looking at that issue. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. So Elizabeth has asked kind of a technical question. Hi, Elizabeth, do you want to share your question?
Yes, thank you. And thank you so much, Elora. This was really a mind-blowing piece of research that, that we can certainly use in our work where we are. And I'm in Johannesburg, South Africa, by the way. And what I wanted to ask you, because as I listened to you and looked at the different profiles and seeing how your work has moved from maths competence to reading skills, and what we have found, and it's pretty general over here, is that there's not always that type of coherence between the two areas of learning. And so what I wanted to ask you, and that was in the chat, you say that your sample was selected, and one of the criteria was that they should have learned French by the age of 3. Mais, quel français? The French of a home language environment and community, or the French of people, especially if you consider, if I may say so, SES, and specifically in the area of Paris, France, is there any chance that some of these kids were perhaps the children of recent or previously immigrated families?
Yes, that's a great point. So yes, we had quite high proportion of children coming from past or recent immigrated families. That's true. We applied this criteria of 3 years old, because we also had like a huge proportion of children which who learned French even way after that, like 5 years old, 6 years old, 7 years old, even in 3rd grade. Because I think we are also targeting low SES, and
sure.
so there is a commonality between that. Yes, but yes, there were children of past immigrants in our sample. Yes.
May I just quickly do a follow-up?
Yes.
So what I experienced as I listened to you is there's something here, you know, it's not the elephant in the room. It's not hiding and it's not invisible, but it's there. And that is that language plays, as you mentioned in one of your one part of your discussion, that oral language and phonological awareness generally has some influence, I can't say impact, on the way you understand mathematics, not only on the way you learn to read. So thank you for a really superb presentation. Merci bien, madame, very much. Thank you.
Thanks. But just to follow up on that, yes, I think oral language and phonological awareness are also really important to take into account within the poor math study, because I did also group comparisons on between poor math and normal math achievers on reading specific variables, and there are some children who are also very low in oral language, and I mean some poor math achievers who are very low in oral language and phonological awareness also. So I mean, it could be I would not say expected, but there are literature on the role of phonological awareness in math achievement as well. So it could be an explanation. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Brilliant questions, Elizabeth. Thank you. So a really interesting question here from Moitaba. I hope I'm somewhere in the region of pronouncing that correctly, which sort of impacts, it links with a question I had as well about these domain general versus domain specific processes, as you kind of modeled in the beginning with your sort of box in the middle and then your sort of two boxes at the side. So there's this kind of, you know, this idea of, as Mojtaba says, there's this sort of, are they occurring in parallel, or are sort of the domain general sort of underpinning the domain specific processes? And I don't know if you did any work to try and unpick that, or if you know of any theoretical stuff that you can comment on that.
Yeah. Yeah, so we did not look at, I would say, serial mediation effects from, let's say, domain general to domain specific and academic achievements. We only treated them in a parallel way. But that's a great point, and there is literature on the fact that domain general, so that there is literature on mediation from domain general to academic achievements through domain specific cognitive factors. For example, executive functions have been shown to impact phonological awareness, for example, in the reading domain, which in turn impacted reading performance. So I think that's an important point, and I would be interested in looking at that as well.
Great, thank you. Great answer. So we've got a couple of minutes left. I'll see if I can finish everybody's questions. So we have a couple from Stanislas, who's very interested in precision, I can see, because he's asked why the term comorbidity was used when the criterion was, you know, just that the the children were just belonging to the lowest 25% of reading and maths, which is an interesting question.
Yes. So I think that's a terminology issue, and I try not to use the comorbidity before this discussion slide, which I think I was maybe tired when writing it. But yes, I would say comorbidity for, I mean, for easiness of representation, to just talk about children having both reading and math difficulties. But you have a great point that these are not strictly comorbid children having both dyslexia and dyscalculia.
Yeah, I do think it's really interesting. And again, it pings into something that I was thinking about, this particular population of students for whom these difficulties sort of overlap, and you know, whether there are any sort of distinct features, as you mentioned, of this population. But again, we've only got a couple of minutes left, so I don't want to sort of go into it too deeply. I will ask Stanislas's other question, which is, do you think it would be possible / interesting to have more sort of varied and precise sociological indicators included?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, of course. So we were kind of, I would say, limited in, like, we didn't want to ask for income, for example, because we went through schools, and especially in France, it is a highly sensible subject, and we wanted to reach as many low SES families as possible, and we didn't want to discourage them from participating in the studies for stuff like that. So we did not ask for income, but studies on SES agree on the tripartite measure of SES, so both education, occupation, and income. So yes, of course, and there is not only those three. There is also like home possessions. There is like educational capital, cultural capital. So there are many other measures that we could also add to be really comprehensive.
Brilliant, thank you. I will just quickly ask Nancy's question because it links to what we were talking about earlier about this diagnosis issue, this identification issue. So she just asks, you know, what was the chance of having undiagnosed children in the study, and you know, is there going to be any kind of follow-up on that, and how would it affect the study? Again, I think it's a measurement issue, isn't it? And it's also a feature of the population. I don't know if you've got any more thoughts on that.
Yes. So yes, so there could really be a measurement issue, because also I did not precise it, but we don't have the SES data. We don't have the questionnaire data for all children. We have like 10% of missing values of parents with, after a lot of iterations, did not give the questionnaire back. So there is that, and there is also maybe parents who don't know if their child is suffering from dyslexia or dyscalculia. So of course there is a measurement error, that's true. I don't think we will be able to follow up those kids by getting back to the parents. Maybe we will have this information, I don't know. I don't think they have this information in the national data bank that's of the national evaluations of the students, but it could be a way. But I think if children are diagnosed afterwards, our study, we would have a hard time knowing it.
Brilliant, thank you. Before we finish, I just wanted to flag up, I've noted it down here, that your findings seemed pretty consistent with Duncan Astl's study. Are you familiar with that, the CALM study? No? I'll send it to you afterwards, but essentially they sort of looked at a wide variety of low achieving students, and they found these 4 distinct profiles, which were kind of poor maths, poor reading, general broad cognitive impairments, and then a bit like you found, which is what made it really flag up to me, no cognitive impairments, but actually the children were having behavioral difficulties, which was, so I just thought that linked in really nicely with your findings and why some of them were showing no cognitive impairment, possibly.
Yeah, that's really something we want to look further, the no cognitive impairment group, which was also found in several studies before. So I think it's really, social emotional skills are a great way to investigate further, I think. So thank you very much. If you can send me the link, yes.
I will send that to you. It's really, really interesting because it also touches on instructional strategies. Is it something to do with how maths is being taught? You know, have they got foundational knowledge? You know, how is it being built up and scaffolded? There's so much you could do. Anyway, we could keep talking for a very long time, but we have managed to get through all the questions. So thank you so much to everybody for coming, and thank you for your brilliant engagement and all your questions. And thank you massively to Elora for such a fantastic talk. I'm really, really pleased and impressed with what you've managed to present for us here in an hour. So thank you so much.
Thank you, and feel free to contact me if you have further questions. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much.